Hello, everyone. My name is Kenita Williams, and welcome to the American Bar Association's Construction Law Forum's Toolbox Talk Series. This is put on by Division 1 of the Construction Law Forum, the Construction Litigation and Dispute Resolution Division. And we basically get together every 6 to 8 weeks and talk about topics of interest to construction litigators. Today, we have our guests, Andrew Vicknair and David Ponte, here to discussed a measured mile, 5,280, I think that's feet, I don't know. But is it that straightforward? And we're talking about modalities to measure productivity on construction projects. So without further ado, I will leave this over to Andrew and David to introduce themselves and get to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Clearly, the expert here is David. You don't want to really hear from me. I'm just going to try to guide the discussion. But Andrew Vicknair, I practice with Darcy Vicknair in New Orleans. Pretty much all I do is construction law. David is the managing director with Ankura Consulting Group. He's in Boston, the managing director. He's got over 35 years of experience in design, construction, and management of large projects. He has also contributed several construction claim-related publications as a contributing author. He is a member of the ASCE Standards Committee for identifying, quantifying, improving loss of productivity, which is a great reference. That's kind of how I got this. He includes forensic analysis of complex design and construction issues. He's issued detailed expert opinions and reports encompassing technical and quantum construction issues, as well as development and analysis of construction costs and budgets. So again, thank you, David, for taking the time to talk about this. So, I want to get started. When I was a baby attorney, I had no clue what the measured mile was. I thought it was related to delay claims. I had no clue. And then I learned real quick. The first trial I was in, luckily, the other side used a different method, total cost, and I got to see an expert just tear him apart with this measured mile. So I guess I was lucky. So now I'm going to turn it over to David. The measured mile is for productivity, measuring productivity. So the first questions I want to ask David, in productivity, what are some of the major factors that lead to productivity loss on a construction project?
There are many factors, some external to the contractor, others that are a result of the contractor's own actions or inactions. But typically where we see a loss of productivity is when you have typically schedule compression. And now instead of having one trade in a specific area, you now have to have multiple trades in a particular room or a specific area working amongst and around each other, which is not as neat and clean had that trade had the space all to themselves. We also see it when you have start and stop work. Typically, a trade has to mobilize into an area instead of just once. It has to do multiple times. This occurs when something comes up after the work is initially started, whether it's a change order or a different site condition. So now a crew or a trade is mobilizing multiple times into a specific area to accomplish a certain amount of work. You can also get it if you're particularly in the heavy civil or site work when you have unusually adverse weather, where you're working in maybe raining, but not raining hard enough that you can't continue to work, but it's enough to slow crews down, and you have to continue to work to progress the job. So there may be times where you have issues due to weather. Force majeure is another thing. And as I mentioned before, change orders and disruption. If you have this is typically what we get into when you deal with cumulative impact claims, particularly where a job has an inordinate amount of change order, which can affect your productivity on various work aspects.
Gotcha. Real quick, this ASCE standard right here, 7121, is the reference I was talking about. And David was a contributing author along with many other people. So if you're a new attorney or you've been practicing for a long time and you just have a hard time understanding the different methods for productivity loss, this is a great reference. You can get it from the ASCE, and it really goes through the different methods. David, the next thing I want to ask you.
Just to interrupt on that.
Sure.
Just not tooting my horn, but you're right about that. But I think one of the best aspects of that document is in the appendices or the index, which has a huge amount of references to various studies on different types of loss of productivity. So if you're looking for where to find documents and papers on different types of loss of productivity, I would start with that document there and just look at the index. Sorry to interrupt you, Andrew. Just wanted to point that out.
Hey, David, we got our first question, so we're just going to lay it out there. How can you calculate a measured mile if you don't have an uninterrupted period?
That's just it. You can't. And you have to, and I ran into this on a matter when I was working with a plumbing subtrade. The whole project was interrupted. So you have to default to a different method. And there's various studies out there. But what I ended up doing, because we were a subcontractor, it was a science building for a local university. And this plumbing subcontractor had done a ton of this work. I was able to use his productivity from multiple other similar projects and kind of use the measured mile, establish a expected productivity or measured mile using other projects. But that's not a true measured mile. And again, as George points out, in order to do the measured mile, you have to be, the preferred way to do it on a particular project is to take an unimpacted portion of the work, and it has to be a large enough. It can't just be a small amount. It has to be large enough that you can establish that was his expected productivity. I say his, the contractor's expected productivity, and compare that to the impacted area. But yeah, without having an unimpacted area, the measured mile is not, you can't use it because you can't establish that, and you have to look for other methodologies.
Gotcha. David, real quick, can you tell us briefly what is the measured mile?
Sure. As we just, and I think George alluded to, it's a comparison of you have the same work, whether it's roughing in electric or roughing in plumbing or installing drywall, installing stud walls, whatever. It's a scope of work that the trade goes in and does, and he's not impacted. There's nothing. He's got the space all to himself. He just goes in, blows and goes, right? He just shoots it out, and that's his work. And then something happens, like a change order. So he gets started, and now he has to stop. And now he can't get the same amount of quantity. If it's in an unimpacted time frame, he was putting up 200 square foot in a day or whatever. But now, because of this change order, this inability to get in to do his work, he's only getting 100. So that's the comparison. He had a productivity loss of 100 square feet per day because he was impacted and unable to get to his expected production that was established using the unimpacted period.
Now, David, I know in the reference we talked about there's different methods. There's the measured mile, then there's a modified total cost and a total cost method. Can you give us a little explanation of the difference between them?
Yeah, when we wrote the study, the intent was to kind of identify preferred methods. What we found as a group, and they were all practitioners like myself, that the measured mile is the most accepted methodology to establish a loss of productivity within the court system. So that was tier one, and there really wasn't any other. That was it. If you had the measured mile, or able to perform the measured mile correctly, that was the preferred method to use, sort of like the gold standard. But as we just discussed, a lot of times you don't have an unimpacted area, you cannot, or you don't have the data, so you can't do a measured mile analysis. So then we defaulted to a tier 2, which included academic and industry productivity factor studies. And this is what I was talking about earlier. The document that you showed, there's a lot of references that shows where all these studies are, what they are, and what they're good for. So basically you use one of these studies to, again, simulate, okay, this is, based on this study, this is what my contractor should have been able to perform in this environment, and thus this is what he actually performed. So here is a productivity loss. The modified total cost is, well, let's just jump down to tier 3, the total cost, because then we can jump back to the modified total cost. Total cost is typically frowned upon in the court system. It's very difficult to establish. Typically what it's trying to say is, this is what we incurred, here's our total cost, this was my estimated cost, I'm entitled to the difference. So it's a total cost method. But it's typical, and there's several factors that one has to establish within using that total cost method. One is that it was impossible or not possible to use a measured mile. And then you have to establish that the contractor's bid was in fact reasonable. Then you have to establish that the incurred cost by the contractor was reasonable. In other words, that he didn't pad his numbers because he was being impacted in additional costs that shouldn't have been in there. And then you also have to identify any contractor cost problems that have been addressed. And it gets very difficult to use the total cost. Whereas the modified total cost, very similar, you have your planned cost, but then you have your actual cost, but then what you have to do is subtract your planned cost, basically your estimated cost. But I'm sorry, I should step back. Again, you still have to use a modified total cost. You still have to establish that you couldn't use a measured mile, and that the contractor's bid was reasonable. But now you're kind of going in and identifying some of the other things, like, okay, your planned cost, you have your total cost, you deduct your estimated cost, you deduct out any cost of change orders, you deduct out any problems that may have been in the bid. So as I talked about, the contractor's bid was reasonable. So if there were problems in the bid, that he underbid something or missed something in the work, that number gets adjusted for it. So it's very similar, but you try to make corrections to the total cost. Again, modified total cost is only slightly better than total cost. And it's one of those last stitch, we don't have any other information type methods. And so you try to establish it using that.
Gotcha. Now, David, when you're getting involved in something, how do you determine which method you're going to use as an expert?
Well, the first thing is we have to establish, what do we have for records, right? Do we have progress reports? Do we have labeled costs? Time and material slips if they're pertinent. You have all the information pretty much listed there. And then what we have to look at is, okay, here is the impacted period. What work did that entail? And then look to see, prior to the impact, was any of this work performed prior to the impact? Was it enough of the work that we can establish that measured mile? Do we have enough of an area? I mean, if you have 10,000 linear feet of a particular work item, but you get in and you do 100 feet or 500 feet of that work before the impact, that may or may not be enough to establish your productivity, because typically what happens on a job is there is a learning curve. Even though the work is familiar, just the logistics of getting to the site back and forth are different from project to project. So even though you know the work and you could probably do it blindfolded, when you first get started, there's still a small learning curve. So you have to account for that. So you got to have at your unimpacted area or period, I said, has to be long enough and include enough work where you've gotten past that learning curve and have established what your productivity is going to be.
So if you don't have the needed records, what do you do?
Well, this goes back to what we were just talking about. You have to look at, what information do you have? And then from that establish, do you know what your crew sizes were? Do you have, I know when I was a young field engineer working for a contractor, I had to track two things for my crews. One is time, and two was how much we performed in a given day. So we knew exactly what went in, when it went in. Not all contractors do that, so it gets to be different. So you have to be able to identify not only how much time was spent on a given work activity, but what kind of, what kind of quantities were installed. Can you track that? And if you can't, then you may have to go back and try to, from the plans, and say, okay, based on our daily reports, this is where that crew was working. Okay, using the plans as a takeoff, try to come up with an estimated quantity that was installed in that period, and then try to use one of these industry factors, whether it's the Mechanical Contractors Association or the National Electrical Contractor has another manual. And there's, like I said, there's hundreds of different studies out there that one can go back to try to establish what their loss of productivity was given a particular situation.
I've always struggled with trying to figure out what are the periods to select, the impacted and then the unimpacted. What are some pointers so that an attorney, or if we're working with an expert, what are some pointers to pick the best periods to compare?
Well, the first thing you have to identify is what is the impact. If it's a change order or a differing site condition, okay, this is the point. This is our inflection point, if you will. So then you have to look at how much of this work was performed prior to that inflection point, if any. If not, then you measured mile may not be approved to you. So the key is to identify what was the initial cause of the impact. What was it, what caused it, and then try to isolate when it had occurred and where it occurred, so that you can then define, okay, you can look at what work had been done prior to that point. And until you identify what the cause of the productivity loss is, it's really difficult to understand that. Sometimes you don't know. And that's the problem with cumulative impact claims. Sometimes you don't realize till the end of the job, and you look at your records and you say, how the hell did I lose that much money? And then you go back and say, well, because I was chasing my tail with all these other change orders, which affected my ability to do this work over here. So then now you're scrambling, one, to establish a cumulative impact claim, and now trying to identify where the loss of productivity occurred. So, but again, it's identifying, first that you have a loss of productivity, identifying the cause of that loss of productivity, and then trying to establish, at what point did that occur? And do I have the ability to use a measured mile or some other acceptable means to establish that?
Does it make it harder to put together if you're on a project and, let's say, instead of one major productivity issue, if you have multiple, say, change orders, stacking of trades, and let's say you got multiple causes, does that make the measured mile analysis harder or easier?
Well, what you have to do is segregate it, right? So if it's different trades or different type, like going back to that plumbing subcontractor, same subcontractor, but he had different systems because it was a science building. So he had water systems, hot water systems, gas systems for some of the labs, and various other systems that were impacted. So we kind of had to isolate each of the systems and then identify what happened. But if you have typically in your scenario, you have multiple trades, you're going to have multiple subcontractors. So again, it's just a matter of trying to isolate each scope of work, if you will, and then address the loss of productivity to that specific item and not get overwhelmed. Because that happens a lot where you have, schedule compression, and they try to accelerate the job. So now you have 2 or 3 subs working in a similar space where before you may have only had one. So now you have to look at each individual sub and how they were impacted and look at what their production was in that period of time, and then establish what it should have been, either through a measured mile or some other analysis.
So in a situation like that where you have multiple issues, is it almost like a bunch of different measured mile analysis segregated to the different causes of the productivity issues?
Yes, I think you have to. Or it may be depending on the different issues. If the different issues are occurring at the same time, you could probably combine them all into one. If you can establish that both of those issues affected that particular scope of work. If not, then you have to identify, what issue affected what work and just kind of segregated it out, and go from that. It all depends on what the issues are and what the affected trades are.
Gotcha. And let me ask you, David, are there any downsides to putting together a measured mile? Is there a situation where it could maybe not turn out as good? Any downsides to using it?
If the measured mile is done properly, it's generally accepted. And typically, again, it's making sure that your unimpacted period is long enough to establish what your expected productivity is. So, assuming that you have that and that it's the analysis is done correctly, there is no downside. Like I said, it's typically considered the gold standard. And what you're arguing about is, well, that's maybe this period or this portion of that period shouldn't be adjusted or whatever. You're arguing about, the nuances, the particulars of the analysis and not the analysis itself. If you use a different methodology, you typically get into a discussion or disagreement about the selected methodology and why it wasn't appropriate. But if you have a measured mile and you use it and you do it appropriately, now you're just talking about numbers and not really the methodology.
Gotcha. Now, you talked earlier about the different type of records you need to help out with a measured mile analysis. Is there anything that you see over and over that if you had these certain things, you would have no problem putting together a measured mile analysis? Is there any, 4 or 5 things that, I say that, so if I wanted to advise my general contractor clients, hey, make sure you keep track of these 4 or 5 things.
Yeah, typically, and this is where a lot of, particularly subcontractors and smaller GCs that don't get into record keeping, like at the end of the day, all they're doing is tracking their labor and how many hours they were on a job, but they don't necessarily track, okay, this crew, these particular individuals work for 4 hours in this area and they installed this amount of quantity, whatever it is. And then these guys went to this and did X number of quantity over here, but instead you have at the end of the day, this whole crew was here for 8 hours. And then, so there's no way to know that they spent 4 hours there, 2 hours here, and 2 hours somewhere else. I see we have another question there.
Yeah. One is, this is from Patrick. What percentage of cases you work have all the information necessary to allow you to do a measured mile?
Very few. To be honest.
And the second half of that question is, do you only see this in larger projects?
Yeah, because I think what happens is the smaller projects, they're just too quick to really, see it, or it's unsophisticated, or it's a smaller sub. that just does, or GC that just doesn't realize they've been impacted. So yeah, typically it's a larger project.
Okay, and I got another question. Excuse me, another question for you from Marissa. How long does your unimpacted period need to be a true measure?
And that's the question. And it has to be long enough that, again, that you can establish that you've gone through the quote unquote learning curve and have established your production on that job. There's no magic bullet, 10%, whatever. It has to be long enough that the crew established itself and was able to reach max production over a period of time. And typically, if you have the records, what you'll see is the production ramping up during that learning curve, particularly in the first couple of days, and then it'll hit a steady line where they're getting approximately the same production over a period of time. So you just want to be able to reach and hit that flat line. Depending on the crew, is it a new crew? Is it an experienced crew? Is it a crew that's been together for a long period of time? Or is it a bunch of guys that you've just thrown together for the first time? So that front end may be longer or shorter, depending on the contractor. It could be an out-of-town contractor calling up from the hall and putting a carpenter crew together with a bunch of guys that really haven't done this work together. They may be very familiar with the work, but haven't worked together. So there's a certain amount of teamwork that they have to establish and work from. So you'll see that learning curve where they're not only learning the work, but they're learning each other, and then they'll hit that flat period. So you just if you have the records, it should a review of the production over daily or at least weekly should give you a sense of when they've hit that peak production, and that's what they should have been able to get.
Gotcha. Marissa, I'm going to share. I came across this when I was putting things together, this little document here, and I read through it. It kind of gives some pointers on how to identify the measured miles. It's another good reference that was available.
Just to mention, Dr. Ribbs was the chair of the committee that wrote the article, and he's out of the University of California, Berkeley, and he's basically his whole career he's worked with lost productivity. So anytime you see something from Dr. Ribbs dealing with productivity loss, I would certainly take a look at it. I think Marissa or somebody, or George, I think, had another quick question I saw pop up from the bottom.
Yeah. Can you use the estimate to validate the uninterrupted rate?
Unfortunately, no, because that's when you start getting into total cost. It becomes more of a total cost. So you want to be able to, again, then you have to establish that the estimate was reasonable, and that it was achievable. So the short answer to your question, George, is no, it doesn't usually work that way.
Okay, everyone, I think we've reached the 30-minute mark. I wish this could be longer. This was really interesting. And it sounds like there's a lot more to discuss. I know some people wanted to get copies of the PowerPoint presentation. I don't know if Kelsey would be able to send it to the listserv. I figure everyone could benefit.
I'll send it to Kelsey when I get off.
Okay.
Send it to the listserv, and I think we can also post it on the blog.
Okay, great. And someone's asking for a copy of the article. So if you can include the article, Andrew.
Yes, I'll send them. I will send that out as well.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
the
Thank
rest of your lunch.
David, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you, David. And thank you, Andrew. Great presentation.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.